Hello, and welcome to our webinar today, The Uninspiring Leader, 10 Fatal Flaws That Cripple a Leader's Effectiveness. This has been a very popular topic over the years, so we're glad you joined us today for this discussion. I'm Brianna Corin. I'm going to start off with a few introductions of who will be leading the webinar today. Joe Folkman is here. He's the co-founder and president of Zenger Folkman. He's globally recognized as a top leader in the field of psychometrics, leadership, and change. He's a consultant to some of the most successful organizations in the world. He's done all of this research, so we're glad to have his expertise. My name is Brianna Corin. I'm the director of marketing here at Zenger Folkman, and you may have heard my voice on our podcast, the 90th Percentile and Unconventional Leadership podcast. We also have Jen Lambert here. She's one of our sales representatives, and she will be manning the chat today. So Jen, do you have any instructions for our webinar guests today?
Yes, thank you, Bree. I would encourage you to engage with us. Any questions you have or any interest you have in learning more, please feel free to chat it in. If you have specific questions for Bree and Joe, please know that we will be following up after the webinar.
Yes, thank you, Jen. Now, first off, for those who may be a little unfamiliar with Zenger Folkman and the services we offer, I wanted to take a second to let you know a little bit about us. Zenger Folkman specializes in leadership development. Our founders are legends in the industry and built Zenger Folkman with the mission to bring science to the art of leadership, because a lot of science was missing in the art of leadership. Our Extraordinary Leaders 360 is award-winning and globally recognized as one of the best and most effective feedback tools in the industry. And we are constantly on a mission to perfect our assessments and our development experiences. Over the last 19 years that we've been in business, we want to ensure that we stay current with the needs of leaders and organizations today. So the insights we share on this webinar are based on large sample sizes. And our research is published in some of the most respected publications, such as Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. You've probably read us if you go on Google. I will now hand it over to Joe to get us started on this topic.
So to introduce the theory and kind of the research that we use to come up with this particular webinar, we started off with lots of research, and the research was really based on theory, where we had 44 different unique assessments, which were theories about leadership, and behaviors that were measured in those 44 assessments. There was over 2,000 behaviors. And what we did is we were interested in which behaviors made the biggest difference. So we did a test with these 44 different assessments where we'd look at the worst leaders and the best leaders, and we'd look at which behaviors really define great leaders. In other words, they were very high, and which define poor leaders, they were very low. And we found in those thousands of assessments, some behaviors didn't separate the best from the worst at all, some moderately separated, and some were extremely good at separating. In other words, they were these kind of nerve-ending behaviors that when people were good, they were rated very high. When people were bad, they were rated very low. We call these differentiating items. And as we clustered these together, we found that over these 44 assessments, the items that differentiated were pretty consistent across these different assessments. And what we did is identified these 19 differentiating competencies. And this is a list of those, and these 5 categories: results, capability, character, interpersonal skills, and change. And you can see the 19 different competencies listed there. Now, we have a couple of questions. When you get all this data, and we have data from thousands and thousands of leaders, one of the questions is, well, which one of those was rated the lowest? I mean, which one did people stink at? That was my first question. The second question was, we asked people to indicate out of those 19, which ones were most important. And so we'd like to know kind of, okay, which rose to the top in terms of importance, And the third question was, which is the most differentiating? Which separated the best and worst leaders the most effectively? And the answer to all three of those questions was the same competency. It was the ability to inspire and motivate others. That's interesting. And as we look at this data, these are the 19 competencies. They're sorted from the best to the worst. You can see honesty and integrity and takes initiative are at the top of the list. But look at what's in number 19 place, inspires and motivates others, the lowest rated competency. And then we ask people which competency was most important for people to do well, to be successful. Number one was inspires. So the competency that we're worst at is seen as the most important. And I'd like you to sort of weigh in here. And when you think about your ability to inspire and motivate others, would you consider that a strength or something you're reasonably good at, competent? Or would you say it's something where you need to improve? Now, Bree and I both got our 360 surveys this week. We do 360s every few years just to remind us of the practice, and we find that kind of things change over time. And Bree, did you enjoy getting your 360?
Yes, I did. It was very positive. I did not invite my husband to be one of my raters this time, and I appreciate it. I didn't do that. I did it last time for fun.
So
And
your
I knew which
results
one
went
was
up because you did.
Yeah. My scores went up.
Okay.
But no, it's always really enlightening and helpful. Just, I always think that people are going to focus on my weaknesses so much, and it's fun to see the good things that they see.
Oh, it is. It is. Although they did catch me. They said my written comments were a black hole. And anyway, and my emails were a black hole. All right. Let's see the results on this. How did you do? Let's see here. Okay. So about 30% said this is a strength. That is wonderful. This is the most important competency. 49% said, I'm competent, I'm okay. And 20% said, well, I need some improvement. Well, as I know, a lot of the people on the call are on here for their own development, but most people are in charge of development for their organizations. So this ends up being a really important competency for other people in the organization too. So Bree, tell us about how people typically do on inspires and motivates others.
Yeah, well, I think that poll is really interesting because I think we got to 69 as far as our audience goes, but you can see from our database, we found that at least 67% of our database indicated that they need to have some improvement on this skill, and 43% said that they were doing pretty okay on it. So this is an area where we do need to improve. A few weeks ago on our podcast, we had talked about uninspiring leaders and some of the statistics behind these leaders. We found that their overall leadership effectiveness, if you were really bad at the skill of inspiring, you were at the 9th percentile. Not great. And the engagement of your direct reports was just you only had 23% engaged. So really, this is a critical skill to focus in on. So these 10 behaviors we're going to talk about today, this is where they came from. In the first study, Joe analyzed 31 executives in a Fortune 500 company that were derailed to the point that they were actually asked to leave the company. And he looked to see if there were identifying signals that predicted their lack of success. In the second study, he analyzed 360-degree feedback data from more than 11,000 leaders and identified the 10% who were considered the least effective. So then he compared the ineffective leaders with this group of the 31 fired leaders and came up with the 10 most common leadership shortcomings. Every bad leader had at least one, and most had several of the ones we're going to talk about today. So what do these 10 characteristics have in common? Well, any one of these issues can be fatal to a person's career and their future opportunities. That's important to remember. Also, managers who failed typically had 3 or more of these characteristics. And identification of a problem is the first step to bring about change, is to realize, oh, maybe I do have a problem with one of these things. So today, as we review these fatal flaws, take a minute, check your performance, think about your team and the people working around you to ensure that this is not a problem for you or any of them that might be dragging you down. So the first one we will get at today, which is ranked #1 for a reason. It is the most common among all of us. It's not inspiring due to a lack of energy and enthusiasm. I'm sure we can all kind of relate with this, especially over the past few years, where you feel like you're being dragged down. These new initiatives, they feel like burdens rather than opportunities for growth. So this reluctance that you may feel to embrace change or take on new responsibilities stems from sometimes feeling overwhelmed, or maybe you're struggling with a clear sense of purpose. So if you were to walk into a room with your team, how would your team describe you? Would they say that you just light up the room, that you ignite energy, that you're excited about the things, or do you suck all the energy from the room? It's an important distinction right there. Now, this may not be your fault. There was a great recent Harvard Business Review article that was talking about feeling overwhelmed, and says the increase in complexity associated with modern life has left many of us feeling in over our heads, because it has become so much more complicated to function in this world today. And that can make you lose passion when you constantly feel like you're behind or that you're not enough. And if you've been feeling that a lot, we invite you to challenge your assumptions and your thinking patterns, because most of the time this has nothing to do with how smart you are, but with how you make sense of the world and how you operate in it. So it's important to recognize, like we talked about, if you feel like you do have a lack of energy and enthusiasm for your job, you need to find your spark again, if you've lost it, to bring better energy to your team. Joe, what's next?
Well, next is this accepting mediocre performance in place of excellent results. Now, these leaders mistake good performance for great performance. They were okay with just doing a good job, just sort of hitting the minimum standards. And they tended to have low standards. They always looked for the low effort option, right? So what's easy? And that was a problem. The other thing is that they were a little bit like helicopter parents. They wanted to protect their teams from being pushed too hard or from doing too much. So they were like mother hens, and they didn't want people to be uncomfortable or to be pushed or to be stressed. And there's some good around that. I mean, we sort of appreciate it, but in terms of how they reacted, these leaders, they weren't terrible leaders. They showed up on time, they got assignments done, they did not cause problems, they were generally liked. But one of the organizations we worked with used to ask this question, and the question they asked at succession planning was, if we put somebody else in his chair or her chair, will they give us more? Will they produce better results? Will they try harder? Will they raise the bar? And when the answer is yes, you're in trouble. And so that was oftentimes the answer, is somebody else could give us more. So I want to ask you this question, and I asked a group this a few weeks ago. In the last 5 years, has your performance and effectiveness improved, stayed the same, or declined? Be honest. Has it improved, stayed the same, or declined? Now, the group I asked it to a couple of weeks ago, every person, there was only about 30 people in the room, but they all answered the same question. They all gave the same response. What do you think? Where's your performance? So, Terry, let me see the results on that. It looks like 64%. Well, it was 100% for the group I asked a few weeks ago. 27% stayed the same, and about 9% declined. Now, I'm going to show you what I think is a humbling piece of research. And this is data from over 70,000 leaders. And what we looked at is overall effectiveness ratings by age categories. And as you look at that, if you're not humbled yet, maybe this will humble you. What we find is that on average, performance or overall effectiveness declines with age every 5 years. Isn't that exciting? And it's really exciting to me because I'm in that last bar. Okay, so it's like the slow march to death. Now, here's the thing. We looked at leaders who were willing to set stretch goals, who were willing to push the boundary, who were willing to go above and beyond. And what we found is these leaders stayed consistently above the 80th percentile. There's a little slight decline as you age, but not much. Kind of a 2-point decline is all. But leaders who are willing to continue to stretch, they don't suffer this same problem. They're in the top 20% of leaders because they're willing to set those stretch goals and really push the boundaries. Now, for a long time, many years, we did an exercise in our training events called the Extraordinary Moments exercise. And many of you on the call have participated in that. We basically ask people to think about a time in their life when they were performing at their peak, when they've accomplished something that was significant at work, that made a difference, that had a positive impact. And then we'd ask people to pair up with another person to talk about the experience, and they'd always be waving their hands and very excited, and they're sitting on the edge of the seat. And then we'd ask them, when you were given this difficult, challenging, hard assignment, how was your engagement? It was sky high. How was your confidence? It went up. How was your life satisfaction? I felt great about myself. And what about your sense of purpose and mission? That all increased. People, employees, if you ask them what they'd like to do, they said, I'd like to be on a beach. I'd like a vacation. But when you give people a difficult assignment that challenges them, that forces them to dig deep, to make a difference, their engagement goes up, their life satisfaction goes up, their confidence goes up. It's interesting because people want to make a difference. Now, they don't want to kill themselves. They don't want to die on their sword, but they do want to make a difference and they do want to make an impact. And as a leader, encouraging people to give their all really helps. The third issue that we found was this lack of clear direction. And what we found is that oftentimes leaders had competing priorities where everything's important. Everything needs to be done. There wasn't any differentiation. And so when everything's important, nothing's important. And they didn't really provide any sense of direction to the group and help people understand how they could add value or what they did that made a difference. There was no sense of mission and purpose other than getting the job done. And what this did for people is it really impacted their effectiveness. When we looked at leaders who were derailed, we found the difference on strategic perspective and strategy and direction was substantial. Those who were derailed were at the 32nd percentile, and those who weren't were at the 54th. And 46% of those managers who rated the leaders said they lacked adequate strategic or operational capabilities. Now, here's some of the comments that people made about these leaders, and you can read those comments about what happened when people lacked strategy and direction. It was terrible. Now, in our research, we found an interesting thing, and I want to show this because I want to kind of make people aware of it if they're not already aware. One of the differences we found is that women overall were rated higher on 16 of our leadership competencies. they were rated more effective. But on 3 of the competencies, they were rated less effective. And the worst one was strategic perspective. The women were rated significantly lower on this one. And you can see here age groups of women on strategic perspective. And notice the gap between males and females on this. We don't understand this. We don't know why it occurs, because women tend to be so much more successful in all other aspects of their performance, but they really suffer on this. Not every woman, but some. And you can see that's significant. Now, as I showed this data to people, some people say, well, that's male bias or whatever. But when we ask people to rate themselves, what we found is women rated themselves lower. So if this is the case for you, if you're a woman and this is a challenge for you, this is going to affect your performance. And again, you don't want to be in that situation where you're not viewed as having strategic perspective. So I'd work on this. Bree, what's next?
Well, the next one is loss of trust stemming from bad judgment and poor decisions. Some people really struggle with decision making. And when leaders start making decisions that don't align with what's best for their team, then trust really takes a hit. This past Sunday, I chose the family movie, and my little people didn't like it, and they might never let me choose again. They might never trust me. But in all seriousness, we mess up occasionally, but some leaders get so wrapped up emotionally that they can't course correct in time. So we looked at leaders in our database that were rated in the bottom quartile on decision making, and we found out that they also struggle with some of these things that you see here on this list. Spotting issues early on, or they hesitate when they should jump on a great opportunity, or they got lost between the fine details and the big picture. So why can't some people just make up their minds? If you go to the next slide, you can see some of these problems. First, procrastination, which we are all guilty of. Leaders keep putting off the decision. They say they need more time. On the other side of that, we have some waffling going on where they can't take a stand, or they lack confidence, and they want someone to help them back the decision. In the next slide, you'll see that, yeah, there's the dependence on others. They want others to make the choice. They want everyone to like them and no one to hate the choice, which you can't get everyone to like everything, right? And others are so disorganized that no decision can be made until the right information has been gathered and a process has been put in place to actually move forward. So honestly, it's no wonder that we all struggle with decision makings, and that can be a weak spot. The next one is about not a collaborative team player. Have you ever noticed how some people view other teams in the same company almost like they're competitors and they act independently? This happens a lot. You might find it surprising, but collaboration, or the challenges around it, ranks as one of the major hurdles in many organizations. Here are some statements that we have on here that you may have heard before. We've built businesses on the belief that by merging various elements, the whole would be greater than the sum of its part. That's only possible through collaboration. Or there's that old saying, all the profit is in the cracks between the groups. It highlights the magic happens when we bridge these gaps and we work together. But here's the reality check. One of the lowest scored areas in a recent 360 assessment was resolved conflicts within the work group. That really surprised me. And from a pool of over 2,400 people, 25% seemed to lean more toward working independently than working collaboratively. And Joe, I think remote work probably is not helping that very much.
It is.
No, and there's this book that I read and is very popular called Boys in the Boat by Dan Brown. And he describes the rowing team as a poem of motion, a symphony of swinging blades. And if you think about it, for a rowing team to really nail it, they must synchronize and pull together. And you contrast that with some workplaces where if someone feels like they were given a little bit more work, they may grumble or give up. That's not fair. But in the world of rowing, teammates embrace the entire team's load. So what if we brought a bit of that spirit into our workplaces? If you had that attitude of we take on all of each other's work and we do it together, you probably would not have a fatal flaw in collaboration.
This can be a real problem for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Now, number 6 is this: you're not a good role model, and this failure to walk your talk. And what we find here is these double standards that some leaders have, and they don't believe that they need to do things they ask others to do, that it's okay for them to act differently than they ask others to act. This is really very common, and we find it a lot. Now, we have some advice if you're acting dishonestly or encouraging others to tolerate unacceptable business practices. And so here's our advice: stop it. Sooner or later, you're going to get caught. People are going to find out. And you look at what happens to people that continue to be duplicitous and to do things that are unacceptable. They get caught, and that will happen to you. And it's a terrible thing. Now, that happens occasionally, but it's far more common for leaders to just act inconsistently by saying one thing and doing another. You're sitting in your office, somebody comes to your door and says, "Can you blah, blah, blah?" And you say, "Sure, I'll do that." Now, here's the problem. You will never remember that you said you'd do it, and they'll never forget. And that's the problem. You sign up for more than you can do. You promise more than you can deliver. You tell people you'll do things you don't do. You're not careful with the commitments that you make. And that is really quite common. Most of you can think about something you said you'd do that you didn't do. And you kind of brushed it off and, oh, nobody really cares. But when people ask the question, does this person say one thing and do another? That's what they think about. So be careful about what you commit to. Don't commit to things you can't do. And when you do commit, follow through. The next one that is significant here is no self-development or learning from mistakes. So leaders feel like they've paid their dues. They've learned, they've gone through, and they've pulled themselves up, and they're doing a good job, and they know everything there is to know about their specific function. And they think, I've earned this. I can relax now. I don't need to change. So the problem is they're not coachable. And we found that a lot of the leaders that derail, this is a significant issue for them because they don't want to hear it. People notice that they're not behaving well. Now, in our 360, we have 60 items, but 2 of those items really get at this coachability. They are, does this person ask for feedback? First question. The second question is, when they get feedback, do they take action to improve? On those 2 items, if people don't get rated highly, if they rated in the bottom 10%, their overall effectiveness is at the 10th percentile. It mirrors their overall effectiveness. And if they're in the top 10%, their overall leadership effectiveness is the 90th percentile. These 2 items have a substantial effect on how a leader is perceived. Now, one of the things we find is that early on in your career, you tend to ask for feedback and do something about it. And you can see those leaders that are 25 to 35, 62% of them are rated above average on this. But every 10 years, 5 years, you can see the decline until you're 61 and over, only 37%. Being coachable is critical throughout your career. And leaders that figure out how to do that and continue to do that make a big difference. And this shows coachability by the engagement of your employees. And when you're not coachable, people don't like to work for you. In fact, you can see the difference in the effect of coachability. As people increase their coachability, the engagement of their employees go up.
All right, the next one is lacking interpersonal skills. So despite the wealth of information out there on the importance of interpersonal skills, we seem to be getting worse at it. And maybe it was all the social distancing. I actually heard that in some companies, HR is now doing etiquette courses for employees who are returning to the office. So it makes sense that this is a common fatal flaw. So there's a lack of trust when this comes from, you can see some of the things up there when we don't have these relationships. And Zenger Folkman did a study to look at how interpersonal skills impact performance evaluations. Now, what you're going to see is these are the evaluations from the managers, and building relationship comes in at, drum roll. Oh, not there, not there, not there, not there, not there. Number 8. It was number 8. So you might be thinking, well, it's not that important. These other skills affect my performance more. But if you take a look at this next graph, here is where we see that people who ranked highly in interpersonal skills, it had the ability to lift all of these attributes with it. You see how those who are in the top quartile in the green there, that all of their abilities and these other skills that are key, like establishing stretch goals, is over 70th percentile. So conversely, on the other side, in the gray, you see that those people who are not good at their interpersonal skills, that additionally, all these other behaviors are affected by that. And it makes sense. If you are not friends or friendly with someone, when they ask you to, let's do this stretch goal, they're like, no, I'm not going to put forth any more discretionary effort for you. So these interpersonal skills make a difference. So the moral of the story, people, is be kind, make friends or be friendly, and don't let this skill become a fatal flaw.
That's an important one, Bree. The next one has to do with focus on the willingness or the desire of people just to focus on themselves and not the development of others. So they didn't make time for coaching or mentoring. And these leaders felt so overwhelmed by their problems and concerns that they rarely paid attention to developing their direct reports. Now, I've made a practice of, when I meet people with really extraordinary skills, I like to interview them. And the question I ask is, well, how did you learn to do this skill so well? What happened? Tell me the story. And the story is very similar, because it starts off with, I was given this assignment. And usually they say, I didn't want to do it, but I didn't have a choice. And the next thing is they said, my manager was confident that I could succeed and be successful. So the manager was their cheerleader. They gave them encouragement. You can do it. You're going to learn a lot. This is going to be a great assignment. But they say, at first I stumped. I was terrible. I did a bad job, but I learned. I learned by doing. And in the job, I had to do this to be successful. And over time, I got really good at that thing. And now I'm considered an expert. So as you think about developing others, so often people think, well, I don't have time. Guess what? You don't need to you just need to find an assignment that helps people to learn and grow a skill that they don't have. The things that you can do to help are, number one, to be a teacher when a teacher is necessary, but number two, to be a cheerleader. And we found that people that were both kind of helpful around instruction and giving their coaching and feedback, but also just the cheerleading, just supporting people when they did it, that made a huge difference. And they were considered great developers of others. The last one is the resistance to new ideas, thus did not lead change or innovate. Now, leaders get comfortable with their current position and status. And oftentimes in organizations, people have a fear of failure. They know that if they make a mistake, and they can think of somebody that was fired when they made a mistake, so they become risk adverse, and they believe that change leads to insecurity and risk versus opportunity and growth. What we found when we looked at the data on leaders who were very poor, below the 75th percentile, and that's not very poor, but below the 75th percentile on innovation, their average overall leadership effectiveness rating was at the 40th percentile. But leaders who were in the top quartile, look what happens to their overall leadership effectiveness. It doubled. Having that desire to try new things, to push the envelope, and in today's business, in what's going on, you need to be innovating. You need to innovate, and you need to push the boundaries, and you need to try new things. And if you are considered one of those Luddites who resist change, you could be in trouble. One of the things we found from individual contributors is we looked at their performance rankings and found that, again, the better they were at innovation, the higher their performance ranking on productivity and effort. So we did a self-assessment with you. In the self-assessment, you were basically asked questions about whether you like to push, drive for results, or pull, inspires and motivates others. Now, in our research, we actually found that 76% of our database of over 100,000 leaders were rated higher on pushing, driving for results, in terms of their effectiveness than pulling. Only 22% were rated higher at pulling, which is inspires and motivates. So what we show you here is your preference, your preference here. What do you want to do? What surprised us when we did this assessment is that over 60% of the people that take this assessment score higher on their preference for inspiring. What we found is people want to be inspiring. That's interesting. They want to be inspiring, but the second part of the assessment measures your effectiveness at inspiring and pushing and pulling, which is inspiring, and pushing, which is drive for results. And you can see if you're above average or below average on those. And that, again, that's the reverse, because, again, people tend to score higher on pushing than they do on pulling. This just gives you some indication of how you see yourself. And what you can do is get a better indication of how you're doing with a good 360 assessment. So let me show you the results of 1,300 leaders who had fatal flaws. And what we found is their average effectiveness when they had a fatal flaw was at the 18th percentile. But if they moved it out of the fatal category, if they moved it from below the 10th percentile to above the 10th, they didn't need to turn it into a profound strength, but if they just made it better, a little bit better, their effectiveness rating went from the 18th percentile to the 46th percentile. We actually found that 60% of the people in our study improved a fatal flaw. Now, as you've gone through this webinar here, perhaps, as we've talked about one of these 10 things, you said to yourself, oh, that's me. I am blowing it. I stink at that. I think it's probably more likely that you said to yourself, I know 2 or 3 people in my organization that are terrible at that. Now, you have 2 choices with other people. You can either go to them and tell them that they stink, which I don't recommend that. That could be tough. But the other option is to say, I'd like you to go through a development process. I'd like you to participate in a 360 assessment. So Bree and I, we both got our 360 surveys this week. I got mine. Bree, you got yours.
Yeah.
It's always helpful. We do this every 2 or 3 years. We find this is a very useful practice. I always get some feedback on things I can do better. Did you get any feedback on that, Bree?
I did, yeah. And it's always really helpful.
Yeah. Well, mine was a little hurtful, but it was all right. About the email black hole. Anyway, I'm working through it, but we also were able to identify some areas that we could turn into profound strengths. And that's most of the exercise here. Again, if people have a fatal flaw, we encourage them to fix that. But if not, work on developing your strengths. So Bree, where do we go from here?
Yeah, well, the first time I wanted to bring this back, the first time I attended our Inspiring Leader workshop that Zenger Folkman gives was my last year in college. I was so fascinated by the research, but it was what you said at the end of that that really stayed with me. And so I have it right here on the screen. You can see some people believe that inspiration is just something that leaders do on big occasions. They see it as the yearly speech where leaders get up in front of all the employees to get them revved up and inspired. But inspiration is so much more than this. Everything a leader does every day has an impact on employees. When a leader comes to work in the morning and they're in a bad mood, that counts. When a leader comes in and shares with their colleagues their optimism, excitement, and passion for work, that counts. And when a leader comes in, ducks into their office, hides in their cave all day, that counts. When a leader takes a few minutes to go around and ask people how they're doing, thank them, encourage them, that counts. Everything leaders do counts. Everything every employee does counts on every level counts. And I remembered when you said that because it's so true. What you do for good or bad matters to the people around you. They don't expect you to be perfect. None of us are, but we should all aim to be better and more inspiring leaders for those who work with us. Now at Zenger Folkman, our mission is to help you to do this. If you're looking for some inspiration, here are some resources for you. First, like I said, we have this session, this micro-learning session called the Inspiring Leader. There's an assessment. There's different strength builders and development guide that you can do. This is great for teams within your organization or any individual leaders, and we invite you to look into that. Next, we have different articles that we have on our website and leadership studies that can help you. We also have a podcast if you prefer to listen in to if you're a podcast person, you can listen in. We have various episodes on inspiring leadership and uninspiring leadership. And finally, if you move forward just a little bit, we have our Extraordinary Leader 360 assessment, which Joe spoke about. This is one of the most powerful feedback tools that you can use to discover your strengths or possible fatal flaws. This is sensitive information, and it's usually only discovered and verified by multiple perspectives from the people working around you in a safe, anonymous format. Our Extraordinary Leader 360 just received another award for being one of the top 10 assessments by Manage HR. So if you want to know more about why this is so effective, this assessment is, you can get with our team members to request a demo. So for our offer today, we want you to be able to host the Inspiring Leader session in your organization. You can see there that we have an exclusive discount for up to 25 participants. That's $5,000 instead of the usual $7,500, and you can indicate your interest in our exit survey. And finally, we want to leave you with a gift for those that give us feedback, because we love to hear your feedback. If you fill out our exit survey, you will be able to get our Inspiring in the New Era ebook, which is full of helpful research tips and insights about inspiring leadership. So you can see the link there in the chat or on the page, and it'll automatically pop up when the webinar is finished. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad that you came along and hope that you join us next month for our webinar.